School of Regulation. Yes, welcome everyone again. We'll start the session with a few words from our director, Dr. Frederick Nyang, and then we'll go ahead with the session. Dr. Frederick.
Thank you, Daniella. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone who is participating in this seminar, in this webinar today. We are very happy to have you here with us, and we'd like to thank you for making the time to come and participate in this very interesting webinar. We have lined up for you a very interesting panel, distinguished ladies and gentlemen who have a lot of experience in regulation and who will be walking us through the process of regulation for those who want to join the profession. So I would like to hand it back to Daniella to guide us through the process, and I hope that you will all enjoy the webinar. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.
Thank you, Dr. Frederick. We have a balanced but also very knowledgeable panel today, and I'm very sure we'll have a great session. Joining us today, we have Ifey Ikeonu, Energy Policy, Markets and Regulation Consultant. Welcome, Ifey.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniella, and thanks everyone for joining in.
Thank you. We also have Harold Obiga, Director Legal Services at the Electricity Regulatory Authority ERA in Uganda. Welcome, Harold.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. We also have Christine Juta, Project Manager for Southeast Asia Power System Transformation at Agora Energiewende. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you very much, Daniella and the ASR team for having me.
Thank you. And last but not least, we have Professor Ignacio Pérez-Arriaga, External Advisor to the ASR. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you, Daniela. Looking forward to participate.
Thank you. Before we continue with the panel discussion, I would like to encourage our participants to write their questions in the Q&A box throughout the session, and then I'll try and read the questions for our panelists. I want us to start the session with an overview of energy regulation. And I would want us to understand the relationship between energy regulation and the attainment of energy objectives. So my first question would be, what is the role of energy regulation in achieving energy targets, specifically on the African continent? I'll start this question with Ifey, if you could impart us with your knowledge on this.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Daniela. Yeah, so going back to your question, why energy regulation and what impact does that have in terms of moving forward the entire dialogue in terms of energy developments, especially with specific reference to the African continent. I think why energy regulation? The core issue that we have to address in terms of regulation, like you know, is governance. And underpinning every aspect of development, it doesn't matter whether it's an infrastructure, political, social, economic, and the rest of it. Governance is key. And what is governance? Governance is the need to establish some basis, some forms of rules and regulations, standards, the guiding principles that are important towards attaining the greater vision in terms of programs, projects, activity, and indeed the vision of governments all across Africa. So what that simply means is that energy regulation is the driver that would enhance the achievement of the larger strategic goals, especially when we're talking about infrastructure development. Energy regulation allows us make the link between planning and implementation. It allows us to also make the more important link between planning, monitoring, and evaluation. It also deals with even another very important aspect, which with relationship to energy sector is very important, which has to do with standard setting, basically. And remember that in Africa, even though we did start with national regulations, as we begin to work towards the attainment of the African single electricity market, regulation also plays a very, very important role, in the sense that it's the tool that would be required towards harmonization of the governance framework across the countries of Africa. So I would want to summarize by saying that regulation allows us to make sure that the vision, the strategy, the policies of government, and indeed the laws that have been put in place are actually implemented. It's the regulator that eventually is able to ensure that whatever vision has been put in place by the various governments are achieved. And you do that towards ensuring that all stakeholders, especially the service providers, are given clear rules in terms of what needs to be done. Enforcement is also very, very important. And like I keep reiterating, issue of setting of standards, basically. Because if you don't have all of these together, essentially, the gap we will see is the big gap between policy and implementation. It is the role of the regulator to bridge that gap, to ensure that those policy imperatives, especially with relation to the energy sector, are actually implemented by ensuring that the service providers themselves are given the right direction, that we create, again, an enabling environment that would allow both private and public sector entities to be able to participate in the energy space and to meet the larger objectives of government. So I'm going to stop there for now so that my colleagues, I'm sure, would have their views on this as well. Thank you.
Thank you for a comprehensive answer. Christine, would you like to add something to that?
Thank you, Daniella. That's an interesting question, and I can only agree with what Ifey has shared around the importance of regulatory governance issues as a key pillar to facilitate the achievement or the attainment of the Agenda 2063 goals in the African context specifically. I think we're all aware that the key issue is around achieving universal access by 2030, which is something which is a far cry for many countries. And one of the other aspects, apart from regulatory governance issues, is on the substance of regulation itself. Regulation is critical when you look at issues around market entry, licensing requirements in some of these countries. It's really important to have the right regulatory frameworks in place to facilitate investment, or to create an enabling environment for investment in the sector, which can only drive more projects on more renewable energy projects towards the attainment of our energy targets, and also in the process creating jobs, creating opportunities for young people like myself in the sector. So it's really a two-pronged approach, issues around the governance issues, which is really very important, but also ensuring that we have the right rules to facilitate some of the good policies we have in place in many countries that require very specific tailor-made regulatory instruments to enable those targets to actually be achieved. Otherwise, we have very good targets in place in many countries, but when you then look at how much money is going into energy projects towards achieving those targets, it's very clear that there is a bit of a mismatch. And I think regulation is a big part of the answer to that problem.
Thank you, Christine. Before I ask this question to Harold, I would want to ask Prof to provide a distinction between energy policy and regulation, and then talk about the role of energy regulation in achieving those targets. Professor Ignacio?
Thank you, Daniella. Well, I think that Ifey has said that very clearly. So the government establishes the policy lines, whether they want a market or they want a central planned approach in the energy sector. whether they go towards having the implementation of a lot of renewables, or they want to have another type of technology producing electricity. They want to support this or that, and then the regulation and the regulators have to implement that. But not only that. I'll try to say the same thing that Ifey and Christine have said in different words. I think my major concern about the relationship between regulation and energy targets is that most people don't understand what we mean by regulation. First of all, we are surrounded by regulation. So the laws, I mean, the regulation of traffic, right? The laws of the road, or how to get a degree, the regulation at the university or at the schools. Parents with the children, they tell them what to do and what not to do. So everything is regulation around us, right? And when people think about regulation and the regulators, they think about boring things. So computing the tariffs every year, supervising the quality of service, giving licenses that more or less are all the same, and determine who has the right to get social tariffs, things like that, right? Boring stuff. But it is not like this. So people don't realize that the success or the failure of crucial businesses depend on how regulation is implemented. And I will give you a few examples. So mini grids. Africa needs between 150,000 and 200,000 mini grids at a cost of more than $100 billion. Well, 3,000 mini grids are being built, and at a pace that is absolutely inadequate to reach, I don't know how many 100 years to reach the 200,000 mini grids that are needed. Because the business model, the regulation of mini grids is not adequate, because it is not able to attract private investment. Only donors and subsidies from development partners are making these mini grids to happen, plus a few very skillful companies that are able to build a few viable mini grids. Transmission investment, private transmission investment in Africa is zero. Everything is done with publicly owned companies with resources that could be used for roads, for schools, for health systems, centers, etc. Why? Because the regulation is inadequate. Because regulation in Africa is done in such a way that it scares away investors. While the same transmission lines are built by the hundreds in Latin America, in North America, in Europe, in India, in other places. Regulation is preventing that private investment to come. Power trade. Well, we have power pools in Africa. We have power pools all over the world. In North America, Europe is a big power pool. But the rules that we have for power trade are impeding trade, are making it difficult by charging the people who cross the border tariffs that are too high. So regulation will make possible power trade. Regulation will make possible to bring private investors into transmission. Regulation will make possible to build the many thousands of mini grids that are needed, and many other things examples that I could bring. And this is exciting because it is new stuff. So this is not what the regulators have been doing all their lives. It is creating the regulation that is able to address the new problems that exist, like net metering. The regulation of net metering is deadly wrong in most countries, and not realizing the best practices that happen all over the world with net metering is being abandoned because it is badly implemented. So lots of fascinating new topics that require that the general purposes that the governments establish with the high-level energy policies materialize in investments, in wealth, in businesses that flourish.
Thank you, Prof. I think the audience is convinced that energy regulation is not boring now. I'd like to ask
We have lots of fun with it.
I'd like to ask this question to Harold as well. Harold, what's the role of regulation in achieving energy targets on our continent?
Thank you, Daniella, and thank you, Christine, Professor, and Ifey. Most of what I would have shared has already been shared, so I'll just go back to a couple of things to kind of contextualize. I think for me, one of the things regulation does bring more than anything else is the certainty of the market and the predictability and that confidence. And I think Professor has talked about this. When in Uganda we were doing a project, our first independent power project, one of the things that was actually lacking at that point in time was a credible regulator. Fast forward, a credible regulator was set up. Now, when you see the leverage that has had in the sector, the predictability, the ability to bring on a predictable, transparent regime of regulation, that has actually resulted into attracting investments in the sector. For this simple reason that the frameworks that we actually do as regulators are not just couched to be a good framework, whether it is net metering, whether it is a renewable energy feed-in tariff. No, you don't just want to put it there and shelve it, but you want to put it there so that it can actually be utilized. So when you put it out there, it becomes a tool, it becomes a trade. And then you're able to leverage private financing to actually come and develop power plants to address your key underlying objectives. Is it something to do with access? Is it number of people that you want to connect? All those can be set out as regulatory targets, for instance, to utilities. Is it megawatts to be purchased? Is it megawatts to be traded? Is it, that kind of thing? And that is what regulation does. The other thing that I think regulation actually does is responsiveness to unforeseen events and being able to cushion those and provide quick solutions. And in this, I think for regulated markets, some regulated markets, like in our case, where there is that certainty, that predictability, that confidence. A simple example is like during our COVID period. In our COVID period, we were still able to keep the electricity sector as a going concern, simply because of the kind of regulatory framework that we had put in place, the predictability, the ability to pass costs through to consumers, for generators, and to create certainty at the end of the day that if you come into this country, into this nation, onto this continent, you're going to be able to achieve your objectives of, say, the return on investment that you want. And I think this is quite critical, because one of the things we definitely lack is that skill set, as well as that ability to put in place good frameworks as on the continent. And regulation does provide that. But I also don't want us to underscore, for instance, the international aspects, which I think Professor mentioned in the power pools. One reason, for instance, power pools may not work so well is possibly there is no regulation in there. Not that there must be, but there are instances where it can be thought through, and having a good regulator would actually possibly move that pool forward, like the Eastern Africa Power Pool is trying to do with its regulatory body. So I think that's how regulation enables us try and achieve the various objectives that we have in the energy sector, whether we're talking of access, whether we're talking of security of supply, and whether we're also talking of ESG factors. Thank you, Daniella.
Thank you, Harold. You talked about skill set, and this takes us to our next couple of questions. What would be interesting now is for each of you to share your individual career paths. You can share with us your educational background, your early career experiences, and what initially drew you to the field of energy regulation. But you can also share pivotal moments or experiences that have shaped your career trajectories and led you to the current roles you're doing now. Each of you have different roles in the sector, so it would be interesting to know how your individual career paths have evolved throughout the years. So I'd like to start this question with Christine.
Thank you, Daniella. That's a very interesting question, one that I don't get to think about as much as I should. But I think that So I studied electronic engineering. I'm from Zimbabwe, so I did my undergraduate studies in Zimbabwe. And immediately when I finished my undergraduate studies, I thought that I would get into the job market, get into a graduate traineeship program, and perhaps work a bit for some time before furthering my studies. But because of the challenging, macroeconomic environment and the tight job market, I had to quickly, continuously develop my academic resume. So I wanted to get into renewable energy policy. Unfortunately for me, I realized there was no such program available locally in my country. So I had to do a master's in renewable energy engineering. And that's where international fellowships really played a key role for me in providing me with the skills and knowledge that is beyond just the technical aspects of electricity or power generation, but really understanding how does this all relate to what is happening in the economy, what is happening politically, how the policy targets are set, and all those conversations, and actually putting me in rooms where you're talking not just to the engineers, but also hearing perspectives from people who work in energy law, energy economists, people who work in energy finance. And initially, I started with a fellowship called the Open Africa Power Program, which is offered by Enel Foundation. And this was the first time I had an experience of what is happening in other African countries. I realized how very small the power market in my own country is compared to other, bigger countries with sometimes very different set of problems. And it was all very interesting to me. And it also broadened the scope of my thinking because I was now exposed to other people who had an engineering background, who were diversified and moved on to focus on energy economics, energy regulation. And I found it all very interesting. So while I was doing the Open Africa Power Program, I happened to also, so it was a year-long program and it wasn't fully in person. So throughout the program, I also participated in a second fellowship, which wasn't necessarily for African scholars, but this was more global. It's called the Energiewende program. And this was an interesting program because it took me away from the African context and allowed me to understand what has been happening in the German energy transition, what is happening in other different countries. We were 5 fellows, people from each of the continents. And again, it was a very big contrast from the African experience, the Zimbabwean experience, and I really got to understand how far gone the transition is in certain countries and how very different the paths have been for different African countries. And all this really piqued my interest, and I got an opportunity to join the Florence School of Regulation team, which was setting up a global hub in New Delhi, in India. And so as I was finishing my master's in renewable energy engineering, I was getting all these short trainings, short courses on regulation for the power sector. There was a training called Regulation for Universal Access to Energy, now called Regulation for Sustainable Development Goal 7. And this complemented my academic schooling really. I can't overemphasize the importance of this. And I think that there's a big gap between what we learn in traditional academia and where fellowships and capacity building programs and short courses can also can take us. So after I did the Energiewende fellowship program, I moved to India. I was there for a year, and COVID happened. I was locked up there. But I was learning a lot throughout the time, working with Professor Ignacio on some of the courses and learning from the experiences of all the other colleagues at the Florence School of Regulation. And it really motivated me to further my studies. So once COVID kind of died down, I moved to South Africa, where I joined the University of Cape Town Graduate School of Business in a unit now called the Power Futures Lab, then called Managing Infrastructure Regulation in Africa. And under the tutorship of Professor Anton Eberhard and the Power Futures Lab team, I started really focusing more on issues related to power sector reform in the African context. And it has really been an exciting journey. And earlier in the year, I had an opportunity to move to Germany to continue on the work of power sector reform, but not necessarily looking at the African context. But now the work I'm doing is focusing on power system transformation in Southeast Asia, which is an entirely different context from Africa, but I'm learning so much. And it's really quite exciting to see how very different geographies are navigating the transition. And we have very different challenges and very different objectives, but everyone is really striving to green their energy mix. And I'm very excited to have the opportunities to work in the sector and to continue to contribute to conversations such as these. So in a nutshell, I would say that has been my journey so far.
Thank you so much for sharing, Christine. I think our participants are noting down the fellowships you mentioned, and hopefully they'll look into them as well. I'd also like to pose this question to Ifey. If you could please share with us your career path, and how do I become an energy a policy consultant and a markets consultant or a regulation consultant?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Daniella. So I think I have a very much longer story, obviously, because by way of background, my training is in law, basically. So I did my first degree in law, and also have a master's degree in law, basically. So my foray into the energy sector, again, wasn't necessarily planned, basically. So, fresh graduate out of school, I had the opportunity of working for the utility company then in Nigeria. Then it was a vertically integrated utility. It was called NEPA. I'm sure everyone who has been to Nigeria then knows NEPA because it was notorious then, and it still hasn't changed much in terms of power changes anyway. So I worked with the legal department, and indeed, my plan then was just stay there. Job wasn't supposed to be very difficult because I wanted to do a master's degree, then move on. Actually, I was interested in energy, but more in oil and gas, essentially. But working with the utility, I just realized how different it was then, basically, because first of all, we didn't have too many women then working with the utility. So what it simply meant was I saw it as an opportunity to kind of develop myself and find how I could add value. And again, I think for me, especially working in the electricity sector was also kind of, it kind of met my demands when it comes to what I would want to say, my diversity in terms of career choices. I mean, I started off in school as a science student. I got interested in law. So at the time I was getting to the university, I wasn't sure, do I do engineering, do I do law? So working with the utility meant I was a lawyer, but I was also working in a technical space, which was something that was of interest to me, while I was in high school. So it was a kind of good balance. So it was, very easy to adapt, under the circumstances. And like I said, I did find it interesting. I found the variety of what you had to do as a lawyer in a utility quite interesting. So, we negotiated gas purchase agreements, we did. Then there were no PPAs, obviously, because it was simply just vertically integrated company. But somewhere along the line, the power sector reform programs all over Africa started. And, the introduction of regulatory commissions as well all over the continent also started happening from about the late 90s up to about the mid 2000s and all of that. So there was a power sector reform committee then in Nigeria. I was fortunate enough to work on the regulation and legal committee of that particular power sector reform group. And of course, through my interactions and the exposures in terms of participating in conferences like the International Bar Association and the rest of it, it was clear to me that the way to go now was regulation, that there were a number of changes that were coming. So I took that opportunity kind of to prepare myself, because my take was, once the regulator came on board, I want to move from the utility to regulation, because I've always found governance also, and policy in terms of the legal framework, quite interesting. Well, long story short, when the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission was created in 2005, I was part of the takeoff team that was nominated from the utility to go start up that the regulator. Eventually, commissioners were appointed, and it took off properly. I worked with the regulator in Nigeria for about 5 years. At first, I was responsible for licensing and enforcement. Afterwards, we had the need to create a strategic and project management office, and I was asked to head that. But let me also say here, just like the point that Christine made, a lot of what I did throughout my career was always to take whatever opportunities that were available to keep learning. So in this whole 10, 15 years between the utility and the regulator, I did loads and loads of certification programs. I had my certification as a regulation specialist. I had my certification as a utility manager. I had my PPP certification. I did project management and all of that. And I think that is really, really important if you want to become very effective as a regulator in the longer term. Because like all agri-regulation is broad. So it simply means that I might have a legal background, but what I've done sitting down in regulation is pretty much cross-cutting. I need to understand the technical aspect. I need to understand the transactions. I need to understand the economics of it. I need to understand consumer affairs, gender mainstreaming, and the rest of it. So what it simply means is that it has to be a continuous learning exercise. And I'm glad when Christine also mentioned Professor Eberhard. I think he's been very instrumental in the growth of a number of us regulators here in Africa. I had attended the MRI course then in Cape Town as well. And I remember being fascinated by the entire spectrum of reforms, regulation, and how that could impact in terms of the development of energy sectors all across Africa. So I would always encourage learning. So it wasn't just physical courses. I also took whatever opportunity I had in terms of developing myself through online resources. Like Christine had said, there are a lot of resources out there. So it's for people to look out for them and see how you can leverage on those to enhance yourself. So again, in 2010, we had the ECOWAS Regional Electricity Regulatory Authority that was set up in West Africa. It's the first of the regional regulators. And I was fortunate enough to be a pioneer commissioner in Herrera that was in Accra. Again, that was, I think for me, career-wise, that was one of the most interesting aspects of my career because we were starting from nothing. We didn't have examples of regional regulators anywhere, basically. There was something in Central Africa, but it was not quite the same with Herrera. So what it simply meant was that we had to learn a bit of, okay, you had something in Europe, but it wasn't also structured the way Herrera was structured as a regulator that had authorities and powers to make rules and regulation. So the 5 years I spent in Herrera as a commissioner and later as a chairperson were actually opportunities for me to learn, to innovate, to bring together all of these experiences I have garnered over the years to find ways of collaborating with key stakeholders because trying to regulate, where you have 15 member states itself required a lot more than regulatory skills. You had to talk of issues of how do you deal with the diplomacy of it? How do you deal with the policy of it? How do you ensure that you're able to get in all of those stakeholders? Well, I left Aurora in 2016, and I think then I made a career decision to go into consultancy because I believe that having spent over 25 years in the public sector, working at the national level, working at the regional level, and haven't at least attained a certain degree of professional satisfaction, that it would make sense if I can use all of that experience and all of that knowledge to see how I can impact on the development of regulation across African countries. So I've been doing that in the last 7 years, basically. I've worked across, a lot of countries in Africa. I've continued to work with Herrera towards the development of the West African Regional Electricity Market. I've been working with Harold and his team in terms of trying to operationalize the IROB of East Africa. I had the opportunity to work with RERA, again, where they wanted to see how we can make, and RERA the regional regulator as well. But more importantly, I've also worked with quite a number of countries in Africa in terms of developing policy, markets, and their regulatory framework. So in a nutshell, what I would say is that the energy regulation space in Africa is big, it's dynamic, it's very interesting. But what I would also encourage people who are interested in jobs in this area is to have an open mind, always have an appetite for learning. And that is why I am really pleased when the ASR eventually came on board. I think capacity building is a big, big gap here in Africa. And having this school now means that people would have that opportunity of having all of these resources in one place. So I would always encourage capacity building. Any opportunity you have to build your capacity, continue to do that. The energy sector keeps evolving. So it means that each time there's a new development, we need to build new capacity in that area. So there are new developments every single day in the energy sector. So we're talking about electric vehicles, how do you deal with them, green hydrogen, all of the big, big issues that are coming out require capacity. So I'm going to stop there for now. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for your comprehensive answer, Ifey. Harold, I'd like you to also take us through your career path and tell us how you became the director of legal services of ERA. And I'm sure we have Ugandans in the participants, so it will be interesting for us to kind of learn about your journey.
Okay. Thank you, Daniella. I don't differ quite so much from some of my colleagues, but I think couple of things that for me had always been key is which space do I want to practice in? Do I want to practice in the public space? Do I want to practice in the private space? The advantage with that kind of decision is that you then choose what you're going to kind of focus on and specialize in. So by background, like Ifey, I'm a lawyer. I'm a lawyer by practice, and I'm enrolled in Uganda. I've qualified in a number of other aspects. I have a Master of Laws. I've done public policy degree, masters too. But ultimately, throughout that journey, just like Ifey mentioned, you have quite a number of certifications that you have to specifically do. I've done one with the London School of Economics. I've done with University of Florida and all that. Now, my journey is also, I don't think, by accident, because I always thought it's important that I practice in law, and I practice something that I am interested in. And for me, how did I zero in on regulation? It's kind of like a halfway point in terms of what I wanted to do, because it's got like the thrill of the private sector. It can be quite fast-paced, quite complex, like the private sector, not typically your usual public sector aspect. So for me, that regulation and the space that I am in was kind of like a halfway point, because my career started out in a law firm. Then I worked with telecommunications for a couple of years. Then I went to banking and finance. Then I found myself in energy regulation, and ultimately I found myself in this power sector. Throughout those industries, one of the things that I learned, for instance, from the telecommunications and banking industry, was that at the end of the day, as regulation is really around you, and it's not hard to transpose the skills that you have, for instance, picked from telecommunications regulation to energy regulation. Some of the concepts are pretty much almost the same. When you go to banking, banking is quite advanced in terms of regulation. So all of them, fortunately, offer different kinds of regulatory spaces in terms of what are they regulating. One is maybe so focused on competition, another is so focused on quality of service, another is focused on, financial prudence, anti-money laundering, and all that. And that is what got me to where specifically I am. But also, when I joined the regulator of Uganda slightly about 13 years back, it was not that sector that you would envy to actually join in, because one, there was always this. We joined in a period when there was quite a lot of turbulence in the market. There was load shedding, power was unreliable, and for me, that gave me something to own into, because I realized that I would have a solution that I can bring on board to the market. And I don't think there is any other space which allows you to experiment as much as possible than the regulatory space. The advantage being that, of course, there's quite a lot of information and you tend not to know it all in the regulatory space, because you need to benchmark, you need to understand what is happening in Uganda, what's happening in Tanzania, what's happening in Africa. And one of my key forums for me that helped me drive that specific need and hunger was the various regional forums on the continent for cooperation, the Eastern Africa Regulatory Energy, the AREA, the Energy Regulator Center for Excellence, the East Africa Energy Regulators Association, the Eastern Africa Power Pool, the African Forum for Utility Regulation. All these are spaces where you actually build your regulatory knowledge. And when we started out then, just like Ifey mentioned, you only had, I think, about like 201 schools to consider if you wanted to understand anything about regulation. That is the South African school, University of Cape Town, and then there was PAC, Florida. However, nothing gives you a better grasp of your career and regulation than the kind of experience that you get in a regulator. I give a simple example. In the private sector, a private person will possibly deal with 1 or 2 projects, but in the regulatory space, you're going to deal with a dearth of different projects across different types of technologies, across different types of skills. Now, I think that's important because you're able to pick interests in very many different aspects. But also, I realized that in the energy space, there is no shortage of qualifications, jobs, and in different aspects. Why, for instance, if there is a project and it's an energy project, the sponsor in that area will have a lawyer, the financier will have a lawyer, the regulator will have a lawyer, the government will have a lawyer. So there is almost that kind of duplicity that you see across the board. And all those, I think, are points of entry into the energy space, irrespective of where you are, and irrespective of some of the skills. And ultimately, what I also came to learn quite fast in my sector is that it's not enough to just have one skill, but you need to have a broad-based set of skills. For instance, if it's legal, it helps you to have an additional skill totally different from what you have. It can be something in public policy, can be engineering, can be, name it, whatever it is, like project management. All these are helpful in trying to understand and approach the energy questions, the energy trilemmas and dilemmas that you're actually facing from different perspectives. Now, because you're able to think through this from different perspectives, you're able to bring forth solutions, because at the end of the day, regulation or the energy space always has something that you are chasing. You're possibly chasing the 600 million people who don't have access to energy, and you have to come up with innovations and ideas for us as nations, as countries, and most of the time, the energy space is kind of like in the middle. So there's never a shortage of problems to solve. If it is something for energy security, regulation will possibly need to be one of the first things that you have to think through. If it is technologies and new technologies that are coming up, regulation is one of the things that you need to specifically think through. In my career, another aspect that I've quickly learned is the need for skills and you to actually hone your skills. It takes a bit of a while because, for instance, a project takes possibly, if you're lucky, 5 years from the time it is conceptualized to the time, for instance, a power project will come online. So there is that need for patience, and that's one of the skills that is quite vital in my career, patience, and to understand what exactly is happening, but also the environment that you work in is very, very helpful. The professionalism that's needed, the kind of work that you get that is required to be very challenging. And I've seen this repeatedly. I've seen us coming up with solutions, and I'm glad to see that we are beginning to slowly but surely demystify what regulation is. For instance, what the African School of Regulation is specifically doing right now. We're beginning to demystify regulation as we get more and more people coming on board, understanding some of these venues that we have are actually what we use for our networking, our partners partnerships up there to understand what's happening in Namibia, to understand what's happening in South Africa, in Uganda. And for me, that has been my career path thus far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harold. Professor Ignacio, yours is a bit long, but then I'm sure you'll be able to tell us in a few minutes about your journey.
Okay, well, I am the oldest in the panel by far. And I requested Daniella to bring some 95-year-old ex-regulator or somebody, but she declined. So as I have a longer life, I have to have the right to have more minutes to explain myself. Okay, so I'm an electrical engineer like Christine. So I started being a young assistant professor at my university in Madrid, Spain, teaching physics, electromagnetism. And I wrote a textbook in the first years while I was teaching. And then I got a scholarship to come to MIT, where I am now, in Boston, and teaching in a course of regulation of the power sector. And then, well, what I did at MIT was more of the same. So I did a master's thesis on computer-aided design of some special type of electric machines. And then I did a PhD in electrical engineering, working on stability analysis of the power sector. So very mathematical, very physics, hardcore electrical engineer. But at the same time, given that I stayed for 6 years at MIT with my master and PhD, I was looking at optimization models for planning capacity expansion of generation, transmission, distribution. My supervisor was the one that developed the theory of a spot pricing of electricity, the locational transmission prices, right? And marginal prices. And so I was exposed to these ideas, but I never studied regulation because there was nowhere to study regulation at the time. So what I have done is to learn by doing. And how that happened? When I returned from MIT, it was 1981, and then at that time, people were starting to talk about the possibility of introducing liberalization in the power sector. Chile did that in 1981, but nobody knew. And it was only when the UK did it in 1990 that people started to look at it was possible to liberalize and to have another type of regulation. But I was lucky that in 1985, at the time that I was putting together a research group at my university in Madrid, using some of the stuff that I had learned at MIT, the government in Spain decided to liberalize not to liberalize, to the opposite, to nationalize, because the utilities in Spain were privately owned, most of them, the electric network, the transmission network, and to create a company that took all the transmission network in the country and was the system operator for all the utilities in the country. That was the first system operator in the world. So I started to think of the problem of how to charge to the different companies that common network that they were sharing. And that brought me to think about transmission cost allocation. And I was lucky because of some friend, and because I knew about the spot prices and I was interested in transmission cost allocation, I was invited by the UN to go to Chile for 1 month and to discuss there with the people that had done the privatization, the problems that they were having in cost allocation of transmission in Chile. And this is the beginning of my consultant career. I've been a consultant or lecturer or teaching in more than 40 countries. The first one was Chile. And well, I realized that a consultant typically knows less than the people that you go to consult for, but you learn a lot in the process, but they listen to you. So this is interesting. And then I participated in the process of liberalization in Argentina because they liked what I did in Chile. They invited me, then Colombia, then Peru, then Central America in a line that was joining 6 countries. And again, I participated in the project for the line and all that. And I learned by doing. So facing regulatory problems that I had to face as a consultant and helping the governments and the utilities in the discussions that they had. And I learned regulation that way. So when liberalization started to sweep Europe, then a regulatory commission was created in Spain in 1995. As I had published some papers and I was active in the area of regulation, I was appointed one of the commissioners. So I was a commissioner from 1995 to 2000. And something that I did, I chose in the allocation of tasks of the regulatory commission to be involved in European matters. And Europe at the time was trying to implement the European directive to create the internal electricity market in Europe. And it happened, and you have been talking about that, Harold, and also Ifey, and about the need to combine different pieces of knowledge. So engineering and law and economics and social matters and all that. So, but I think that engineers have an advantage. When you have to create that market and particularly to face the problem of how to share the network of 27 countries. Well, at the moment we're less than that, but basically 20-something countries. Then you have an advantage in the discussions if you understand more or less law and economics, but you really understand the engineering component. So I was kind of leading the regulators in the conversations with the system operators and the governments in creating the law that allowed us to trade power in Europe. So I learned about that. I was also participating in the design of the Central American market. And then when I finished my time as a regulator in the year 2000, the presidents of several of the regulatory commissions asked me to teach a course on regulation. I had started to do that with what I had learned in my consultancy at my university before being appointed a regulator, but that was a formal request to organize a training course for the staff of regulatory commissions in Europe. So I did that starting in 2002. I repeated in 2003, and then the presidents of the regulatory commission said, why don't we create a school of regulation? So they appointed somebody as the director of the school, and I was the one teaching. So we were 2 people and 1 coordinator of the courses. And this is how the Florence School of Regulation started officially in 2004. So I created the course of regulation. So teaching what I had learned in my experiences, mostly in Latin America, in Central America, in Europe, implementing the internal electricity market, and as a regulator during my years in Spain from 1995 to 2000, at the time that we implemented also a market in Spain. So I've been teaching regulation then for about 45 years. This is what I still do. Well, it happened that after that, I was invited by the government of Spain in 2004 to write a white paper on to evaluate the reform liberalization that had taken place in Spain, particularly in the wholesale market, and make recommendations because some things were not properly happening. So I did this white paper that had, well, some impact, although the government did the opposite exactly of what I was recommended. But and then I took the opportunity that from MIT, they invited me to go there for 1 year as a visiting professor. That was in 2008. And then I accepted, and I went there and they asked me to stay. So I stayed for 12 years teaching regulation of the power sector at MIT, but at the same time keeping the teaching at the Florence School of Regulation and my contact with my research group at Comillas University. Everything combining the developing of models, regulation, and yeah, basically that, right? Something that happened also is that I was invited to be a member of the Court of Appeal of the Regulatory Commission in Europe. So ASR, the Agency for the Coordination of Energy Regulators, which is like a ERERA, let's say, in Western Africa for Europe. And it has a Court of Appeal. So I became like a judge for a number of years. And then in Ireland, they were looking for an independent member of the Regulatory Commission for the entire island. As you know, Northern Ireland belongs to the United Kingdom, and then you have the Republic of Ireland in the rest of the island. So they had 3 members in the commission from the north, 3 members from the Republic, and I was appointed the independent member. So I was a regulator for 5 years also in Ireland. And that was a very, very interesting experience. So that is my experience as a regulator. Then at MIT, I took advantage of some grant that Tata Power, not Tata Power, the Tata Business Emporium had given to MIT, a large endowment. And with that money, they wanted to have projects to help in many different areas, development in India. So I applied to do something on electrification in India, that at the time had 300 or 400 million people without electricity. And we developed some tools for electrification planning and some regulatory approaches that could be useful. And I visited India many times during those years. And it happened that at the same time, I was doing a project called The Utility of the Future, a big one, $3.5 million, sponsored by 15 large energy companies in the world. And we produced a report on that. And then a couple of foundations, first the Shell Foundation and then Rockefeller Foundation, came to me saying, could you apply these ideas that I had applied to Europe and North America and more or less Latin America to Africa or to India, places where they don't have still universal access to electricity? And then I embarked into that about 10 years ago or so. And well, we proposed a number of things, and something was created, an organization by Rockefeller Foundation called the Global Commission to End Energy Poverty. I happen to be the director of research of this group of 25 leaders all over the world in energy, proposing ideas, one of which was to create an African School of Regulation following the model of the Florence School of Regulation that I knew quite well. And then, well, it happened that after a couple of years of discussions and all that, a group of these organizations that were in this global commission that I was mentioning before decided to launch the initiative, and they asked me to be the interim director to guide the process until we could have the school with an African director placed in Africa, hosted by an African institution with a viable program of activities and a viable budget. And this is what I have been doing during the last couple of years. I dropped MIT. I decided to work on that. And I have been the interim director until exactly 1 month ago, where Frederick Niang, that you have met a moment ago, took over. And I am very happy that after a very hard and long process to select the director, we successfully selected Frederick. And now I am an advisor. And I don't know what I will do when I grow up.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much for sharing all your knowledge with us. And thank you very much to Christine and Harold and Ifey as well. I think all those years combined would make a very big energy regulation machine, and it would be interesting to see. We have a couple of questions from the audience. I'd like to read some of them. We have a question from Michael Irenge from Netis Group, an EPC company based in Rwanda. And his question is, as energy regulation is a new context in many African countries, sometimes the integration of public-owned companies does not offer opportunities for new developers, to grow, and this results in an unfair competition in the market. And for this reason, consumers are the ones suffering from that injustice. So based on your experience, what do you think can be done to overcome this issue? I think I'll let Ifey answer this question, and then I'll read the second question.
Okay, thanks again, Daniella. Indeed, the question actually goes to justify one of the reasons why regulation is important, basically. Because remember, like I think we've said somewhere in the course of this conversation, that most of our countries, or indeed the way utilities were run all over the world up until the very early 90s, where we had vertically integrated utilities that eventually had to be unbundled in some countries. In a number of African countries, obviously, we still have a lot of vertically integrated utilities. But one thing that has happened now is that with regulation, it has opened up that space. So the question essentially is, how can we use that to create an enabling environment and a level playing ground for private sector companies? I think that is really, really important. That is really what regulation should do. And I know that, in country after country, like I said, I started working in Nigeria, essentially. And part of what we did in terms of developing the licensing procedures and everything was to ensure that those procedures made it the same requirements for whether it's a publicly owned company or a privately owned company to meet the basic requirements. So no concessions were given, for publicly owned companies. So whatever criteria was set for market participants, for new entrants into the market, would be the same, regardless of whether those entities are privately or publicly owned, basically. Then indeed, even at the regional level, I know that part of what we did in terms of opening up the electricity space to all sectors was to issue the directive on the organization of the electricity markets in the ECOWAS member states. And of course, part of what was in that directive was that every member state was enjoined to make sure that their laws and their regulations enabled private sector participation, made it easy for private sector entities to participate, basically. And by signing, to this directive, it just means that regulators would need to do a lot more to actually put into practice what has been done. So part of the challenge we've had, I think, is not necessarily on the governance side, because I'm sure we're all familiar with the Electricity Regulatory Index for Africa. And what that index has shown, year in, year out, is that on the governance level, most of our countries have laws, allowing for private sector participation, enabling regulators to make the right regulations that would, ensure that is done. But unfortunately, there are limitations. One is capacity constraint. I think I talked about that. There are times when perhaps the regulators, maybe because they are new or we not over the years built up sufficient expertise in regulation, do not exactly know what to do, basically. So that is one. Of course, another issue which I think we need to be frank about in Africa again is there is also some degree of political interference, in terms of the work that some regulators do, basically. So I know there are times when a regulator will make a rule saying that a publicly owned utility has to do certain things. Then the government comes in and says, oh, well, this is from the government. You need to somehow allow some degree of concession, which really should not be the case. But as the as the rural electricity space is also getting more and more how would I put this? As we are actually developing more and more capacity in that space, more and more regulators are actually also a lot more confident in terms of what ought to be done. So ideally, having a regulator in place should be an incentive for allowing private sector participation, because you have to put in place those rules that would allow for even things like open access, licensing framework, the tariff, and all of the, those key things that private sector participants would want to see have to be there. If somebody is going to bring in money into the sector, he wants a tariff methodology framework that clearly shows that he's going to get some degree of allowable investment on his return, basically. So if we do not put in place things like the tariff frameworks, which are within the mandates and purview of most regulators, that in itself would act as a disincentive, basically. So like I said, on the governance side, a lot of regulators can do all of this. In terms of practice, there are limitations, but I also know that work is being done in country after country to close these gaps. In West Africa, where I've worked, in the last 20 years, and I'm very familiar with that space, part of what has been done at the regional level is to offer technical assistance to states, NRAs who are unable, perhaps for one reason or the other, to put in place those right tools, or also using the regional approach to ensure that member states themselves at least have some degree of a harmonized approach that would allow private sector participation in the energy space. Because with that, then it may be difficult for us to meet all of those objectives that we talked about in terms of universal access, in terms of encouraging renewable energy efficiency, because all of these are areas where private sector participation will be most beneficial to countries all across Africa. So in a nutshell, regulation should actually incentivize private sector participation where it's properly done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ifey, and I hope Michael was able to get an answer to his question. We have a question. This one would be for Prof, and then we'll take another one for Harold. For Prof, what should happen before business models or regulation for effective energy access? In 2 minutes, Prof, business models or regulations for effective energy access?
Regulation.
Okay.
Of course. Regulation is what makes business models to be viable, right? So I think that, for effective energy access, I think that you need first a plan. You need to know whether energy access should be provided with grid extension, mini grids, standalone systems. So you need to know what has to be done and what is the cost. Second, you have to decide who is going to do it, and who is going to do it is where regulation enters in parallel with business models. So you have to decide whether it is the responsibility of the distribution company in the territory to do everything, or just to extend the grid. And if to extend the grid, given that this is expensive, what happens with the tariffs to cover the cost of extending the grid to people that probably cannot pay the tariff or the cost of doing that, right? And then some mini grids. And well, are you going to assign the mini grids to the incumbent distribution company? Are you going to have some tenders? How the mini grids will be paid, the cost? Are you going to implement some subsidy? Or what is the method? It is willing buyer, willing seller, or what? So again, regulation. And of course, I don't think that leaving it to the market or leaving it to the donors is the solution, because in Africa we have 3,000 mini grids instead of 200,000. So something is not working. And the same thing with the standalone systems. Are you going to provide some subsidies to these to the providers of solar kits? Are you going to provide some subsidy to the customers themselves that qualify because they are poor? Are you going to run also some tenders? And so everything, the core of the success is to this interplay between once you know what has to be done, who is going to do it, under what business model, under what regulation. And of course, you have to pay for that. So there is a third step, which is, well, the government that is in the end responsible for the operation has to find the money to do it with their own funding, with development partners, with private investment. If you are successful in step 2, probably you will have private investment. If you don't design viable business models, private investment will never come. You will have only donors, and you will never electrify your country fully.
Thank you, Prof. So regulation it is. For Harold, we have a question on can you list out various kinds of contracts that an electricity lawyer providing legal services to energy companies is expected to draft?
Thank you, Daniella. So, most naturally, the kind of contracts that you're possibly going to draft will be largely based by the kind of project that you specifically have. But I think we have come to a way where they are pretty much fairly standardized documents that you're going to interact with, whether it is a power sales agreement. The power sales agreement is probably one of the most common that you're going to become familiar with. And it's pretty much most of the risk that right now has gone into most of these standardized agreements is almost agreed or known as. However, I want to add a little bit of salt to that, because whereas that is the case, like for instance, in Uganda, we standardized the power purchase agreement. There are underlying aspects which, when you come to your country, they may not be applicable. Africa has done a good thing in putting out a lot of knowledge on what is really the acceptable standard for instance, power purchase agreements. There is a whole host of other agreements that you have to sign. You have to have a direct agreement for the project between the lenders. You have to have between the lenders and possibly the government of the nation where you're going to develop your project. Ultimately, if you mention, but you have licenses. So every kind of project, depending on the technology and the technology posing different risks, may tend to have different licenses, and every country will have to possibly have different types of terms and conditions which they want in their licenses, and that will come from the regulator. But in whichever form you are involved in a project, you're going to want to be familiar with that. And ultimately, you get the project done not just with having good documents, but actually having implementable projects. So you have to have a good EPC contract, not just a good EPC engineering, procurement contractor, but a very, very good EPC contractor on your project, so that the risk is fairly allocated. They know what they are doing. The milestones for project development are well articulated. And now, of course, there is, because for Africa, you have for instance, many first-time investors. They want guarantees. They want maybe sovereign guarantees. They want implementation agreements. They want support agreements. And what I've seen on the continent, I've seen that there is really no uniform practice. One country will be happy to give you a sovereign guarantee. But when you go to another country, like possibly Kenya, they'll probably give you just a letter as the guarantee equivalent that you need. But that gives comfort to the project. At the end of the day, depending on the risk, and those are just some of the surface documents, but there's a whole list of other documents that have to be done. Shareholder undertakings that you have to undertake, financing agreements that you have to sign with your bankers and with your financiers. You have to sign fuel supply agreements depending on the technology. For instance, if it is gas, if it is oil, you have to sign, and you have also political agreements, like political insurance agreements. You can consider risk. You'll, for instance, have a political insurance guarantee from MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee. The Africa Trade Insurance also issues a political risk guarantee instrument to give confidence to the lenders in the project and to the project sponsor that should anything go wrong in this project, there's going to be recourse to to, there's going to be recourse for the project. Ultimately, of course, there are the constitutive company documents, and that's also a whole dearth of documents. What I want to, in terms of the agreements, is that depending on the risk and the allocation of the risk, you may need a whole suite of documents, or you may just need certain documents coming through for your specific project. Thank you, Daniella.
Thank you for comprehensive answer, Harold. We have questions on skill sets in the chat, but which I think would be beneficial for our participants. So I'd like to ask this question to Christine and Prof. What specific skills and qualifications do you believe are crucial for individuals entering the field of energy regulation? We touched a bit on this at the start, but then it would be interesting for you to reiterate that for our participants. So Christine first, and then Prof.
Thanks, Daniella. That's an interesting question. I think earlier on in the discussion, Harold very rightly said that in the energy regulation space, you can't know it all. There's so much going on, and there's a lot of change and innovation happening. So there's a lot of skills to be learned. But I think it's important to just say that, in my view, I would say a good grasp of power market design is important, especially because of the evolutionary nature of the sector and how we have so many things moving and so many moving pieces. It would be important as somebody who wants to get into the energy regulation space to have a good grasp of the emerging trends. And what are these emerging trends? I think obviously understanding renewable energy technologies, understanding new storage technologies that are coming up. So these emerging technologies, what are their implications for energy regulation? What kind of incentives can be, what kind of regulatory instruments can incentivize the adoption of these new technologies? As Prof mentioned, it's regulation and then business model. So what are the kind of regulations you need to put in place to for us to get to a place where we can have viable business models for the implementation of these emerging technologies. Related to that also, it would be good to have a good grasp of some of the environmental considerations, which are increasingly becoming important as we move towards greening the energy mix. We are talking about sustainability more and more. We're talking about reduction of emissions. And I think that anyone who's working in the energy regulatory space would need to have a fair understanding of what are the broader implications of this. You don't necessarily need to be an expert on all those, but it's important to understand what is happening and why the regulator might have to make certain decisions at some point in time. In addition to that, I think obviously we are seeing more and more digitalization. So there is increasingly becoming scope for people with those kinds of skills have being relevant in the energy regulatory space, and as well as really, I think, having a good understanding of how each of these affects each other. And I think what we are seeing now is that the space is becoming more interdisciplinary. So you might not necessarily want to continue identifying yourself as an engineer. I think Prof. Ignacio is a very good illustration of that. He has worked as a regulator, he has worked in academia, and all of these experiences really feed into each other. So I think a willingness to learn, because I wouldn't want to say there's one certification one can do and you put it in a drawer and you have mastered energy regulation and you're good to go for the rest of your career. I think it's a continuous process. There's need for continuous capacity building. And even with the programs that the ASR will be offering, I think we're going to see more and more different courses coming up each year as we have different problems. I think finally, I'll also say a good understanding of political economy, and especially nowadays, energy security has become more and more of a concern. I think it's also a good objective for regulators, and anyone working in the space really needs to have a broad understanding of some of these implications. And of course, you need to understand policy analysis in order to interpret the policy targets that you're trying to implement. So in a nutshell, I would say it's a bit of a cocktail of different things, but depending on the specific space you find yourself working in, you might necessarily need to hone in a bit more on market design if that's where you're focusing on. But it's good to have a fair understanding of what is happening across the board, to have that helicopter overview. But I would like to reiterate what Harold said. You can't know it all. There's just too much happening in the space, and it's exciting as well, because it means that there's more and more opportunities coming up, and we need more programs that allow different experts who have specific expertise in very different areas to talk to each other. Because sometimes what ends up happening is you have people who are very specialized in one particular skill, only talking amongst themselves and very rarely having opportunities to learn from each other. So that is also really going to be very important. And I think it will also be important to learn from the experiences of other countries. Yes, you might be working in your specific country and have expertise in understanding what is happening in that country context, but there's very rarely anything new under the sun. And it's always worthwhile to get a sense of what has happened in the country next door. So there are also opportunities for peer-to-peer learning, even amongst the regulators themselves.
Thank you very much, Christine. Prof, well, what does a perfect regulator look like?
Well, in summary, you have to be an electrical engineer, right? No. This is exactly the opposite. As you have seen in this talk, you can approach regulation from many different angles. In my courses at the Florence School of Regulation, my courses at MIT, I have a variety of people attending the courses. So I have people that have nothing to do with engineering, people that are maybe a physicist that is doing something on new materials and have no clue of economics, law, or power systems. And we have this type of people. So I think that when I teach these courses in regulation, I don't try to make them uniform. Each one learns things complementing what they previously know. And I think this is what makes regulation such a very special topic that gathers all these different types of disciplines, and you need a team of people because nobody is able to control. I remember when I was very proud when I was a member of the Regulatory Commission the first time in Spain, and because I had been in Latin America, I knew more than my colleagues who were new to the topic and all that. And then the ministry sent something because they wanted some ideas about to have a first draft of the wholesale market that we wanted to implement in Spain. And then I started to write a decree myself. And well, I did a very poor job because I didn't know how to write a decree. It's not just to know the content. You need to know that document has precedent in the other legislation. You need to know what is your role of that document in the chain of legislation and regulatory documents. I didn't know how to write this thing, so I knew the core, but nothing that approached what the final document was in the end, right? So you have to learn other things that are not in your domain. You have to be open. But everybody, starting from her or his specialty, can contribute to regulation. And of course, I would say that something that is needed, which is not being an electrical engineer, but it is to understand how a power system works. So everybody has to have a basic knowledge, in the same way that you have to have a basic knowledge how you have primary regulation, legislation, and secondary, and all the chain of different things and who is responsible for what. So this is basic understanding, and also you need to know the basics of economics, that you have capital cost and you have operation and maintenance cost and all these things. So all the basics you need. Then I think that there are two types of training that we have to be careful at the African School of Regulation to provide. One is this more innovative type of regulation to approach, to address the new problems that we are facing, like, well, large deployment and integration of renewables, investment in transmission, as I said, private investment, how to address the problem of universal access with the 600 million people without electricity in Africa, etc. but also what are the normal practices that, for instance, Harold was presenting in his last intervention. And I think that we have to pay attention to that, so people know what is the normal business that a regulator has to face in the different positions in a regulatory commission. And the last thing that Christine said, I would really emphasize, I've been teaching regulation for more than 40 years. When I go to teach one the next year, and I go to, for instance, what I am doing here at MIT, I have come only for 1 week to teach a fraction of my old course. And then I look at the slides from last year and I reject at least 1/3 because I have changed my mind, because new things have happened. So regulation is a little bit like journalism in that regard. You have to be abreast of the news, because otherwise you get obsolete in months. So because new things happen, developments, etc., and here and there in your own country, and then you have to keep track of the political economy, what is going on, the new ideas, the new decisions by the government that changes things. You look at the European market and the problems that we had with the spikes in prices and all that, and we have changed the rules in the last couple of years. So you have to be continuously watching what is going on.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much, Prof. We have a couple of questions around renewable energy, and I think it kind of goes into the questions that I had as well. So as the global energy landscape undergoes a significant transformation with a growing emphasis on renewable energy sources, there's a need for sound regulatory frameworks to support this transition. My question is, how do you envision job opportunities evolving within the sector of energy regulation, particularly in light of the increasing focus on renewable energy? I'd like to give this question to Ifey.
Okay, thanks again, Daniella. So renewable energy, obviously, especially here on the continent, it's one of the most pertinent issues now that regulators need to deal with. And I think more so because when we look at the statistics that show that most of the areas that do not currently have access to electricity are in the rural areas, and the fact that it is likely that access issues on those areas would perhaps be heavily dependent, in the deployment of mini grid and solar home systems and off-grid systems that would solve that problem. And again, I think for us as a continent, remember that we are blessed with solar energy sources much more than any other continent, and the possibilities of harnessing that into the energy source that would deal with the issue of helping us achieve the universal access targets. It's something that should always be on the table for discourse amongst regulators. So in that regard, the challenge is what needs to be done. Prof made the valid point, which is that most of the projects we have today when it comes to mini grid systems are all grant funded, basically. And I'm one of those who share the view that as regulators, we must begin to find ways of looking for and supporting business models that would ensure that moving forward, there has to be a more sustainable means of funding mini grids to make sure that in the longer term that they achieve the purposes for which they are set up for. All across Africa, I'm sure we're familiar with projects that were started with grant funding. There may be 3, 4 years, 5 years down the line, when the batteries need to be changed, the grant funds have all but died off. Those projects are no longer there, so you still have challenges with access. So what does that mean? It means that regulators must begin to think outside of the box, basically. Part of what I had, proposed in the other panels and all of that I've said is maybe again that we should also begin to think of the way subsidies or interventions are deployed. We have a situation generally where we keep looking at, okay, give this intervention to the project developers and let them deploy these mini grids. But when you talk of sustainability, the real challenge is the end users. How do you empower them to make sure that across the years they are able to pay some money that is going to support the operation and maintenance of all of these systems moving forward? And perhaps that is the space where a lot more discussions need to come in. Maybe we as regulators will have to begin to think, more proactively in terms of how do we really manage issue of subsidies? Must it always be top bottom? What of approaches like we've had in some countries like maybe Bangladesh and the rest of it, where the subsidies actually maybe as spread over time in terms of the end users that would enable them, be empowered longer term to be able to pay for the cost of electricity. So that is why I think that there are opportunities, within that space in terms of having people who are going to come up with all of these ideas, looking at business models that will work. And more importantly, once we have these business models working, then what it simply means is that we are going to be able to have the opportunity to fast track access using renewable energy. And in that way, we are able to create jobs that would allow more and more people to come into the renewable energy space in a manner that is sustainable longer term. So I think there is a lot to be done. Luckily, again, like Christina had said, the renewable energy space is also one of those areas where technology is growing day and day. Basically, we might have cheaper sources of renewable energy. We might have to find ways of ensuring that we harness all of the R&D that is going on in this area. We have to pay more attention to research and development, looking at problems that are peculiar to the African continent. Affordability is key, basically. So usually when this, when a whole lot of this technology have been developed elsewhere, perhaps what they're looking at is in terms of efficiency, is not necessarily costs. But for us here on the continent, we have a lot of young people who also are tech savvy, who should begin to think of how do we ensure that solutions are not just efficient, but affordable. I think affordability is important. I think that whatever is being done on the job level, whether it's at the policy level or the regulation level, and even in terms of technology, we should always have at the back of our mind that on this continent, we still have more people living on less than $1 a day than any other, group, band, and all of that. And those are the band that we are targeting in terms of renewable energy, using that as a way of ensuring that we meet that access. So again, opportunities exist. We've been banding the number 600 million people who need to have access. Most of that access is going to come by way of renewable energy. So it just means that once we're able to put in place the enabling framework that we unlock that potential, then we're going to see the job growth across every sector. So whether it's in tech, or it's in policy, or it's in tariffs, or in business transactions and all of that, is an entire ecosystem. So those opportunities exist, but we also have to really begin to think outside the box, really begin to think of how do we find a solution that works for us here on the continent, instead of just having people coming and giving us money and saying just go do it. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ifey. We have a question in the chat box. This one is for you, Prof. I am part of a team. This is Tsepo. I am part of a team to soon develop a regulatory framework for the development of renewable energy projects for my home country, Lesotho. The main challenge I already know we're going to face is the balance between the heavily subsidized grid energy and the cost-reflective tariffs of the off-grid solutions. Tsepo is asking, with your experiences, how do you find a trade-off between such in terms of regulatory framework?
Okay, if I understand the question, the idea is that the tariff that people connected to the grid have is not only cost reflective, it is subsidized, so it's below cost.
Mm-hmm.
and the off-grid solutions are expensive. And therefore, well, how to make possible that people may have electricity with off-grid solutions. They will be waiting for the grid to arrive with cheap tariffs. So how to address that problem? I think that the problem is at the heart of universal energy access. And I've been thinking about that for a long time. I can tell you in a nutshell what I think, but I recommend that you go to I will put that in the chat box, the document that we have on the integrated distribution framework that I think is a useful one. Okay, so I think that the idea first is to realize that we have a system of cross-subsidization among customers in every country that we are not aware of, but it is very strong. So in Lesotho, I am sure, in the same way that in Spain or Italy or Australia or Kenya or Zimbabwe, the people that are connected to the main grid, they pay the same tariff if they are in the same category of consumers, regardless whether they are in the center downtown of the capital or they are in the countryside, if they are connected to the main grid. But the cost of distributing electricity in the countryside is several times more expensive than the distributing electricity in downtown. They pay the same. So why not to extend this idea that is universally accepted, that there is a uniform tariff regardless the cost? So nobody is paying a cost-reflective tariff. People living in urban areas pay more than they should, than the cost that they have, and people in the countryside pay less. We have that established. Why not to establish the same idea to extend that to mini-grids and standalone systems? Let's start with mini-grids. Mini-grids are the least cost solution in the countryside when the extending the grid is too expensive, because you have to extend the grid maybe 20 kilometers with a 11 kilovolt line to reach a village that has a total demand which is equal to 3 times my apartment in Madrid, which is not a great apartment. I have a contract for 5 kilowatts, right? It is inviable to do that. It's much cheaper to have a mini grid in that village and to provide electricity, even if per kilowatt hour providing electricity there is more expensive than the average tariff that people pay connected to the grid, because they take advantage of economies of scale in generation, etc., and much larger demand to spread out the fixed costs. So why not to have the same tariff and cross-subsidize in between the people connected to the grid and the people in the mini-grid? Of course, there will be a problem of, in total, I mean, depending on the country, if you are in Kenya, you will have to cross-subsidize. Maybe Kenya has an electrification rate of 75%. So you have lots of people to try to cross-subsidize the rest. If you are in Colombia, you have 97% electrification. You need to electrify only 3%, and it is very easy to finance what remains, right? Same thing in other countries in Latin America. But in Africa, if you're in Malawi with 13% electrification, it is impossible to think that you are going to cross-subsidize with 13% the 87 that are not electrified. So of course you have to do other things, right? You need to maybe not to do the whole thing at the same time. You have to go step by step. But I think that step by step, the people connected, being provided electricity with mini grids, should pay the same tariff as the people connected to the main grid. And the rest could be partly cross-subsidized with the other tariffs, and partly with other subsidies, and something that I cannot talk now because this is not exactly the question. It will take some time, is to talk about viable financial plans for electrification. When people think of financial plans for electrification, wrongly, they seem to think that they have to finance electrification tomorrow morning. No, you can receive concessional loans with 7 years of grace period. You don't have to return the debt in 7 years, and you have maybe 20 years to return that, when the people have had electricity already for 7 years, and they may have some tariffs that could pay a large fraction of the cost. So, I mean, I have done numerically very serious financial analysis of electrification plans in some African countries, and it is possible to reach by 2030 full electrification and finance the plan so that you return the debt and all that by 2040, for instance. And then you have the people that the least cost solution is standalone system, solar kits, or if it is a larger load like a school, a health center, or some commercial or small industrial activities, you could have some standalone systems for them. Okay, so in that case, I don't think that the tariff should be the same because the level of service is not the same. They should pay less. And again, you need to have some method of cross-subsidization so that these people, the poor people there, pay social tariffs, and the solar kits that they receive are partly paid by them and partly paid by the by whatever subsidy scheme you could come up with. This is a long discussion. I have just given you the basics, but you will find, for instance, in the 3-day conference that we had in our website, 9 hours of discussion that are recorded, and a document that I wrote on business models for mini grids. You will have a wider explanation of this topic. But there is a solution for that.
Thank you, Prof. I think we have a very specific question from Aaron here. Aaron has a social enterprise called the Community Revolution that aims to develop energy hubs. And they recently completed a feasibility study in Kenya looking into sustainable business models around community energy hubs. A key component of the value proposition of these hubs is that they aim to have local contractors install and maintain the systems. And they want to train local talent to carry out installation and maintenance. He's asking, what are the key skills lacking in the industry, and what policies / regulations are relevant to these skill gaps? And he learned that in Kenya, for example, there are relatively small amounts of fully qualified solar installation engineers. This is a very specific question. Maybe I'll throw that question to Harold. What key skills do you think are lacking in the industry? Specifically this question, yeah.
Right. So thank you, Daniela. So I'll just give you almost a similar scenario, which when we set out to increase our access, one of the things we established was that there were no solar technicians who could actually do these installations for us as a country, because we had a target of say connecting X number of people per year. When we looked at the number of technicians whom we would need, for instance, to do that door-to-door connections, those door-to-door connections, just simple electricians, were missing. The second thing that also we established in that period of time is what kind of qualifications do you specifically want to do, for instance, an issue of access? Do you want people who have degrees? Do you want people with high technical qualifications? And we zeroed down on key simple technical qualifications, which we call and our installations permits committee. So we have what is called the installations permits committee, and one of our objectives was to actually increase the skilling in the community and in the country, so that we could have enough people who are actually qualified to be able to undertake installations in the country. Now, the skill set, I think for me on the skill set, we have learned that the skill set, first of all, differs and is also specific to technology. Like you've mentioned, solar. We realize that if we're going to do access, maybe rooftop solar, those are totally new skills that people need to do. But it's not just the skills of, for instance, installing the solar panels, the water heaters, but also the aftermarket support that is required in these specific skills. Is it actually there for the products that we are rolling out. If maybe you are talking of standalone systems, is the aftermarket support actually there? The other question that is also important when we're thinking about the skill sets, for instance, to grow different businesses, is their diversity and their spread. Why I'm mentioning diversity and spread because one of the things we realized is that there was a disproportionate number of females and males in this skill set. And we took out specific initiatives to scale, for instance, the girl child and women to participate a lot more in the energy space. But also in terms of growing skills, to address some of the skills gaps that we established, we left this to utility companies, and what the regulator does, what the regulator does is we support all utilities to be able to train people. For instance, they can train electricians, they can train lawyers, they can train economists, and that is funded by the sector to make sure that throughout the period of time, there is a continuous pool of people. Reason being, we realized, for instance, we didn't have safety engineers in the market that we needed. We didn't have generation plant operators in the market that we needed. Or we had them, but they were not specialized. So what would then do with the utilities is would allocate money overall for the whole sector, and they would undertake to practically train these various occupations and various talents that we have, and so that they can be some good online training and on-job training for the specific graduates at whichever levels. I see that Professor's hand is up. Thank you, Daniella.
Thank you, Prof. Go ahead.
Well, just in case that can be useful, I know that Strathmore University, Professor Isael da Silva, has a laboratory for solar facilities. They have training course for solar installations, and also in collaboration with Strathmore University, there is something called the Mini Grid Academy, and they run every year courses that I think take a couple of weeks or so, training people to build, maintain, operate mini grids.
Thank you, Prof. That's very useful. And to end on that note, I'd like for us to share resources that would be useful for our participants. We talked about energy regulation being a dynamic field, but then to end, what are some of the pathways available for individuals looking to progress, but also excel within the energy regulation industry? I think this question is quite similar to what we have in the chat as well from Taiwo. So what are the resources you would recommend for our participants looking to progress, but also excel in the energy regulation sector? I'll start with Christine.
Thanks, Daniella. Again, just to reiterate that there's a wealth of knowledge out there, and one is spoiled for choice. I would say that a good place to start would be identifying good sources of information that are reliable and current. There are several flagship publications that are annual that give updated information just to give a good understanding of what is happening in the sector. For example, documents like the Africa Energy Outlook, the World Energy Outlook, tracking SDG 7, those would be good sources of information. And then on the capacity building, and of course, the African Development Bank's Electricity Regulatory Index for Africa, that's also a good source of information. And then on the capacity building side of things, we have put in the chat the link to the African School of Regulation website. I know there's an upcoming course, if I'm not mistaken, on regulation in the context of Africa, and also several other conferences and webinars which will be happening. So again, those will be opportunities to, as Prof put it, stay abreast of what is happening, because things are constantly changing and the material also is changing. So even for people who have taken part in some of the courses that are offered by the ASR, or if you're doing some of the webinars, try and refresh your memory where possible. So I would take advantage of short courses as much as possible, because they tend to be more agile in adapting to the changes that are happening in the market compared to the pace at which an academic curriculum is changed. For example, it takes time, but with short courses you kind of get things that are more relevant in the moment. Also, aside from short courses, I think it's good to also look into fellowship programs. These are good because these are typically sometimes fully funded, or they are online. Some people have constraints around residential programs because of work commitments. So if you look into online fellowship programs, online training programs, I mentioned that I took part in Open Africa Power, for example. I know it happens annually, opportunities such as that, and there are so many other similar fellowships which happen annually, which allow you to not only learn from the experiences of seasoned experts who have been working for years in the sector, but connect you with young people who are on the same career path. It's been so interesting for me personally to look at the evolution of the career paths of some of the people with whom I've met in some of these fellowships. And you can already see that 10 years from now, I can look around me and I have a rich network of people who are moving on to occupy key positions in their countries of influence and in different sectors. And we continue to meet each other in different fora, and those networks are invaluable. I can't really overemphasize that. And of course, depending on whatever foundation you have in terms of your academic background, don't limit yourself to what you studied foundationally. Be dynamic, cross-learn as much as possible. If you're an engineer, talk to lawyers, talk to economists, and vice versa. I think that if you look into opportunities which are interdisciplinary, those will be very beneficial because they broaden the scope of your understanding. As Prof mentioned, of course, you need the basic technical appreciation and maybe other considerations, but it's important to broaden the scope of your thinking as early as possible where you can, and continuously adapt and learn. But I would say look into short courses that are relevant. The ASR is a good place to start. Also look into fellowship programs, and importantly, attend conferences, network. I think nowadays there are so many opportunities to get access to information and to meet some of the people who make the decisions or who write the reports or publications that we ultimately read. So attend conferences and network as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Ifey, would you like to share some resources with our participants as well?
Okay, so thanks, Daniella. I certainly do agree with the points that have been made by Christine, basically. And I think that one recurring theme throughout the conversations that we've had in the last couple of hours is the need to ensure a very wide knowledge base if you really want to excel in the field of regulation. I know Prof likes to taunt that we all need to be electrical engineers, but I'm not exactly sure. Actually tell him that engineers make poor regulators, I think. I think that the lawyers and the economists are better. Because somehow, by virtue of our training, we tend to take everything into account, basically. So the lawyers will do on one hand and on the other hand, and for the economists, always all things being equal. So that means that they need to consider all things. Anyway, jokes aside, I think having a very good understanding of those core areas, you know, like Prophet said, you may not necessarily know how to draft, but you must know what is the primary law, what is the secondary, and the less. For those of us who come from a legal background, understanding the power sector is so important. Understanding the electricity market structure is very important. Understanding economic regulation is very important. So regulation really is broad, is cross-cutting, and so that point has been made. I also, of course, agree with what had been said by Christine in terms of trying to leverage on every opportunity for short courses, interventions. But one other area I also want to talk a lot about, which has helped me and which I've also tried to impact on other people who are interested in the energy sector, is on the mentoring programs. There are lots and lots of them all across different fora. We have the ASR, for instance, which is the International Confederation of Energy Regulators. They have a mentoring program for younger people in energy regulation. We have the Global Women in Transition Network. There's Women in Energy. Again, let me also say that maybe coming from my background and the need to bridge the gap, which Harold had talked about in terms of the number of men and women in the energy sector. I've taken a lot of interest in lots of programs in terms of mentoring younger women in the energy sector. I think that is important. Those opportunities are all out there. I would also add some of those resources to the chat so that we can benefit from that. Some of us did not have that, maybe in terms of our career growth, basically, and I guess that would have been much more helpful in terms of trying to plot through, the whole energy landscape. But luckily, we are where we are, and what we try to do is also to see how we can build skills in those areas. So please find ways of attending conferences. That point has been made already. There are very, very good areas to meet with people, to share experiences, and to also learn in terms of development. And like I keep saying, we must keep learning. I'm sure even Prof, with all his years of experience, is still learning because this is a very dynamic sector. So we must all keep learning. We must all find ways of ensuring that we build knowledge. I think it's interesting. The opportunities are there. There are loads and loads of them, but it works best for those who have a mind for learning, a curious mind, who are lifelong learners. So I would also encourage that. And like I said, networking is so, so important because it is those networks that will let you know where those opportunities are. And I would also help you through some of the more difficult career choices that you may need to face as you go along your career path in the energy regulation sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ifey. That was very insightful. Prof?
Sorry about that. Okay, so I do agree with Christine and Ifey 99%. But there is a 1% that I want to point out, which is when I said before that we started teaching, when we created the Florence School of Regulation, a course for the staff of regulatory commissions. The first one was two week long, very intensive. So we brought about 40 or 50 people, and we were teaching 6 to 8 hours per day, including the Saturday in the middle. And that was an avalanche of information. We repeated that on the following year. And it is impossible to assimilate things in a short period of time. So one thing is that you could have a short course to talk about power purchase agreements. You could have a short course to learn about, I don't know, power pools and rules for power pools, or you could have one to learn about licenses, etc. A course on regulation of the power sector is impossible to teach in 1 week or 2 weeks. So you need an extended period of time. You need people to really read some material, think about it, do some homework. And that takes, when I teach that at MIT, people devote a lot of time to my course, and it is 4 months. So 1 term. The same thing at Comillas University. At Florence School of Regulation, it's a course of 8 months. 1 week presential at the beginning, 1 week presential at the end for case studies, and 8 months in the middle. The one that we are now teaching at the African School of Regulation is 3 months, basically. We started on April 1st. We are going to finish with, it is online, with 1 presential week devoted to case studies in the last week of June. I think this is the minimum that is needed for people to get a good grasp of the entire regulation of the power sector, not a particular topic. I think that the regulation, I mean, you don't want to learn electromagnetism or thermodynamics or in 1 week, right? So it is a matter as serious as those matters, or common law, or whatever course you are thinking, economics 2.0, right? In 1 week, come on. Regulation is the same. So if you want to learn a good grasp, you need time.
Noted, Prof. Harold, to end, what would you recommend in this case?
So I would recommend a couple of things. First of all, I want to really recommend self-study for the simple reason that you're going to have to put some extra back in yourself and spend time actually educating yourself without necessarily actually there being an opportunity. I mean, it took me over 3 years when I joined regulation to actually have an actual regulatory course. And that's partly because of the scarcity of them, but also in terms of them just not being available. But we've had progress since then. The Africa Legal Support Facility has put up a very good course in terms of contracting in the power sector, and those are free resources you can actually access. The other aspect that I would also want to underscore are the conferences. They're important in terms of keeping in tune with the trends. The Africa Energy Forum is one good conference that happens every year. Africa Oil Week happens quite so often. Power Week also happens, but also at international level. There are also international regulatory conferences that happen every so often. And most of these other institutions that are existing, that are regional blocks, for instance, the West African Power Pool, the Eastern Africa Power Pool, all of them tend to offer short-term courses to kind of build your knowledge step by step, just as Professor has specifically mentioned, that you can't really understand this in one go. So I think those are some of the things that you need to pick up, but I still, as one of the things that I would want to emphasize is the need for self-study to keep abreast. There are a number of podcasts out there that you can also listen to from reputable schools, where you just get to know how is this being dealt with in Brazil, how is it being dealt with in Argentina, and then of course the benchmarks. When we're doing our independent power transmission framework for Uganda, we decided to do benchmarks with a number of countries to understand what's happening there in Australia, in Brazil, so that we can have a hang of what exactly it takes to develop a power project in transmission.
Thank you very much, Harold. We had a I personally enjoyed the session, and I learned a lot from you guys, from Professor, from Christine, Ifey, and Harold. Thank you so much again for giving us 2 hours of your time and a minute now to going through the energy regulation field. I would want to thank our participants for joining us and to keep checking our website. We'll be uploading the recording of this session shortly, and we hope you enjoy the session. To close, I'd like to invite Dr. Frederick to share a few words, and we'll end the session.
Thank you very much, Daniella. It was a wonderful session. We've had a wonderful panel. And personally, I've learned a lot, very interesting experiences from Professor. We never get tired of enjoying the words of wisdom from Prof. And from Ifey, who is a member of the ASR board. Thank you very much. And also from the younger people in the panel, Harold and Christine. I think you've done us proud. This has been wonderful. And I noticed in our audience, we were up to almost 195 persons participating at the same time. I think this is really great. And we hope to be doing more of this. And as Daniella says, please keep looking at our website. There's a lot more that we have on offer for you. And we hope that we'll be able to share all this with you. That is why ASR is here. We are here for you to help you with your journey in regulation. Thank you very much. Back to Daniella.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Frederick. And I wish you all a great day. Have a great afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you're from, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. Congratulations.